Hello and welcome to what may very well be another episode of Entertainment. I say that because Greg and I have talked about which podcast this will be dropped on, probably mine. But I'm joined today with my dear friend, Greg Kaminsky, who would be talking about his newest publication, Celestial Intelligences, Angelology, Cabala, and Gnosis, Giovanni, Pico, della, Mirandola's quest for the perennial philosophy. Greg is a podcaster and author of several books. And will you tell us the other publications you've had?
Sure. Thanks, Kid. It's a pleasure to join you here. And you can find me online, Occult of Personality, where you get podcasts, or on socials. And the other books include Proneus, a reflection on the preliminary practices of Buddhist Tantra, and The Art and Science of Initiation, which is an anthology published by Louis Masonic. And that came out, I think, in 2020 or 2021, which I have an essay on the ancient cult of Samothrace in that book. So, and obviously the podcast as well. So Occult of Personality is still going strong.
And then we're going to talk more about levels later on. But as Kendrick Lamar says, there's levels to it you and I know. There are levels to your podcast also, yeah? There's a public version.
Yeah, so the public Occult of Personality podcast, and then we have a members section called Chamber of Reflection at chamberofreflection.com. We also have a Patreon, so our members' content's available on the Patreon. And so generally there's interviews on the public podcast, and then we have like a members section portion of the interview, and then we have some lectures and guided meditations and research papers and different type of content that's just generally designed for people who are wanting to go deeper, explore more, maybe try some different practices, or get some advice on how they can deepen their spiritual practices or figure out their path if they have questions about that sort of thing.
Yeah, in the member section of your podcast, Occult and Personality, and the membership section is known as Chamber of Reflections. I can't remember if that's plural. Chamber of Reflection. I've been fortunate enough to participate in the series you're doing now, which is the series on meditations on the tarot, published anonymously, but posthumously known as being authored by, is it Vladimir Tomberg?
I think it's Valentin.
Valentin, which is a fantastic book and a fantastic project that I believe has also birthed a series of other podcasts of a similar idea.
Yeah, so in the Chamber of Reflection, we've got the recordings of all of our meditations on the tarot, study circle, meetings, discussions. And basically, anyone who's interested in studying the book with us, we encourage them to join us, or simply join the Chamber of Reflection, and they can listen to the discussions and get a lot of really tremendous insight and exploration of each meditation on the major arcana, which to me honestly has proven to be absolutely astounding in terms of the effects and the growth of my understanding of tarot symbolism, and the way to apply it to my own spiritual practice is just, I didn't even know this level of benefit was possible to get using tarot in this book, but it turns out it is. So
it's interesting. I've been thinking about it a little bit recently, because within this book, and here's the book, Meditations on the Tarot, It's
A
subtitled in
journey into
English,
Yeah, go ahead.
A Journey into Christian Hermeticism. Um, and there's a famous photograph of it on the desk of one of the popes. I have a Catholic friend who was like, yeah, but you don't know if his secretary brought it in. And then my neighbor Nate is like, who is like, yeah, but it's still on his desk. Like, come on here.
You don't make it to that desk without passing through a number of evaluations.
Yeah. So it is a phenomenal book, and it's amazing how many people in the group have shared my experience with it, which is 10 years ago. We poured through the pages of it, and then we put it back on the shelf, and it was sacred, but we didn't even know how to interact with it. And it was so cool that 10 years later, everybody's like, oh, okay, we can try this, and it is mentioned at one point in this text that a number of spiritual organizations had organized themselves around the tarot. And I can sort of see why as we fumble through this material. Now, we're not a lineage or anything of that nature. We're sort of this loose affiliations, but you mentioned that it was a place to sort of go deeper in this exploration. And that's what I'm finding from being in this roundtable discussion group on this topic, and also the Discord channel that you have working along with it.
That's great. I'm really glad you're finding that, because, well, I have to give a lot of credit to my co-host Billy Hepper, because really he was the inspiration for doing this whole project with Meditations on the Tarot. And we're also really fortunate to have Michael Martin joining us, who is the director of the Center for Sociological Studies. And he has read this book and taught this book, and he has interviewed and interacted with the translator of this book, Robert Powell. And he has a tremendous background in English literature, Catholic theology, mysticism, and I feel like his addition with all of us and our backgrounds is it really, like, the sum is greater than like all the parts put together, really.
Which is echoed in the idea in the text that wherever two or three are gathered in his name, there I am in the midst of him. Let's work a little bit backwards, and we will get to your book at some point, but let's work a little bit backwards. What is Meditations on the Tarot for those joining us?
Well, really, Meditations on the Tarot is a sort of personal exploration, contemplation of each major arcana, with the understanding that the author of these meditations has a extensive background in Christianity, specifically Catholicism, mythology, Western esotericism, and ceremonial magic, and initiatory orders, philosophy,
And also, if I may, the Orthodox traditions, because my understanding is the Orthodox traditions also refer to themselves as Catholic.
True. And so I think from the contemplations of these arcana, we're given a depth of insight that you don't actually really encounter with tarot teachings for the most part. These are contemplations that allow one to apply the symbolism of each arcana directly to their own life, spiritual path, spiritual practices, ways of being. And really what I found is if we apply the teachings and the lessons that it contains, our experience is altered without any question.
And so this is, I think, part of the agenda of the book, so to speak, which is that I misspoke previously to friends that this book had no mentions of tarot readings. I think it has one mention of tarot as a divination system in the 600 pages of the book. This is a book that explores the imagery of the tarot as a sacred text and sacred symbolism.
Yeah, and I would say it doesn't lend itself to, the book doesn't lend itself to the reader doing divinations specifically. But if one actually studies this book and learns what it's communicating, one who did divinations with tarot would inevitably improve their skills at it, because their understanding of the symbolism and the ability to interpret it in the language that it's communicating to us grows exponentially. And so you couldn't help but benefit from that. However, that's not the main intention. The main intention is really to allow us the opportunity to gain some wisdom through the study and practice of the tarot. And that's not really, you're right, it's not really divination. It's really truly contemplation and study and engaging with the meaning of the symbolism so deeply that we become it, essentially.
And so contemplation might be a good point to dwell on here, because it also features into your newest book, Celestial Intelligences. So would you tell us what contemplation is?
Well, contemplation is oftentimes, in a superficial sort of a way, regarded as thinking about things. But that's really the exact opposite of what's going on. Yes, at the very start of one's contemplation, it is inevitably a contrivance of a person thinking about things. Yes. But it very quickly departs from that as one shifts from thinking about the object of the contemplation to beginning to sort of feel into that, which shifts the whole register from the mind, the head, the intellect into the body. It's a somatic practice that truly engages with all the senses and allows us to transcend our reflexive self-evaluation, self-concerns, that sort of even having like a reflexive, like attention that turns back to the self, because when one's truly contemplating, the attention is completely outwardly directed to the object of the contemplation. Now, I say outwardly. If the object of contemplation is a thought or a visualized image, then that's not technically outward in a physical sense, but in a metaphysical way it is, because inward in this sense means attention focused on the human being and their beingness. And in contemplation, that's engaged with and then in a way left behind as one feels into the object of contemplation, then starts to get insights or impressions that one may not be able to superficially get. And then very shortly at that point, it becomes a situation where the contemplator is, in a sense, gone, because their attention is so focused on the object of the contemplation that they become that, in a sense. And if someone's done this, they know what I'm talking about. And if someone's not done this, there's no way they can possibly really understand what I'm talking about. It's like trying to describe to someone what it's like to be drunk if you've never had any alcohol. I can tell you about it till the end of time, and you're still never actually going to understand what I'm saying.
Yep.
This is very similar.
And so it's interesting. I wonder so we were just talking about Meditation in the Tower. The book, it's a very long book that has time to enumerate many of the pitfalls it sets up earlier, because it sets up the major arcana in a series of letters written to us, its audience. And each arcana of the tarot exists to antidote some of the pitfalls that may develop from the previous one. So it presents itself as a spiritual growth and development.
Yeah, I would also argue that if you successfully accomplish each arcana, then it's already remedied the potential pitfalls. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So what you mean to say is that if we're looking at something sacred, it will be complete and whole.
Yeah, and if we understand it to the level that it's asking, we can only do that if we become it, if we are what it represents, and therefore if we can do that, then we become complete and whole also.
Okay, my question to you is, for that you're outlining a progression that seems to go, generally speaking, from thinking about a thing to feeling its resonance, its effulgence. I'm using this language that that's a little bit more impressional, or impressionistic. What is the danger or pitfall of that being itself an intellectual conceit? Me sitting down on a cushion and going, you know what? I was contemplating the Four Noble Truths, and then I was bathed in its unceasing glory. Or is that actually something we touch on? Is it something we touch on, but you don't want to? Carlos Castaneda's teacher, Don Juan, would always tell him not to indulge. So maybe I'm just talking about the indulgence parts that comes afterwards as a self-reflection.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I think the bigger danger is people think they're contemplating and they're not actually contemplating. I think that's more likely, and it's way more likely, and it presents way more of a problem than actually doing it and somehow screwing it up.
Yeah, so this is Bob Black's criticism of spirituality, which I don't fully agree with, but I see his point, which is I think he says that something like spiritualists have unnameable experiences that they won't shut up about.
Yeah, and this is the same thing I was posting about yesterday with that Henri Corbin quote, where he talks about, mystical experiences, if they're not really grounded in the study of philosophy, like what he's trying to say is, like, any philosophy that does not produce spiritual experiences is a worthless waste of time. And he said, and having those mystical experiences without a grounding in the study of philosophy, you're at the danger of, like, ego inflation, like misinterpretation, like all sorts of errors, ascribing like conclusions to those experiences when you could be wrong about the conclusion. And so that's, I think, what is the thing.
Yeah, and so one of the antidotes mentioned in an anecdote in Meditation of the Tarot was, I think it was Jacob Bohm, who was a cobbler or a shoe repairman, basically. And so it said, he didn't have the luxury of thinking he was better than other people because he's got to go to work. And our friend B-Love once told me 9 times out of 10 the answer is get in your car and go to work.
Yeah, I mean, this is really the thing. And this is also, I think, the antidote to people who think that they have some sort of spiritual attainment. It's like, okay, let's see you on the job site. Let's see you interacting with your family. Let's test your spiritual attainment in situations that require extreme patience, generosity. We'll see, that's where the rubber meets the road. And so, yeah, someone who spends their day making and repairing shoes that literally walk on the earth, like, there's a reason we use this term grounded.
Yeah.
And this is the reason.
And that's humility, which comes from humus, so the earth.
Yeah, it's humility, but it's also it's also the understanding that our spirituality is in no way separate from any part of our life whatsoever. And we don't try to separate it.
Okay.
And for a lot of people, that's a revolutionary idea, I think.
Yeah. So the quote in meditations is ora et labora, so work and prayer.
Yes.
And you're talking about kindness as a form of work, which is interesting.
It is really a form of work, and it is super interesting because it's not just sort of drudgery work. It's like there is that aspect, but there's also the self-discovery and the insight and the continual unfolding of it, which, I don't know, if you're bored by that, then there's just no hope, really.
Really, because I'm bored but intrigued, because you said something that really interested me one time. And it was interesting. It was in us beginning to talk about the idea of doing a podcast, and then I wish I'd recorded it, but it was interesting because I was kind of talking to you about how, like, you learn about these organizations and you hear about this sort of like secret sect, like the sect behind all the sects. And in Meditation of the Tarot, it used the term hermeticists. And I'm like, who the hell are hermeticists? Or if you read Invisibles, they're like this invisible organization with like a white pin with nothing on it. And I'm like, okay, is this just an ego game that you think you're going to find the secret spiritual masters? And you're like, no, that's real. But the only mark of it is kindness. And that's not what I thought it would be, because, Liu Ming, the Taoist and Buddhist teacher, says he always thought his spirituality would be like a hat, meaning it was something he could put on, show others, wear. And what it means is that there's a secret art of learning kindness. It doesn't have its own hand signals necessarily. Individual organizations within it might. But it just drew me back to the idea that what we're trying to practice is kindness, which I didn't think as I logged into, Occult of Personality.
No, that's a good point, because it's true. I feel like, and I don't know, but this is just what I believe based on what I've studied, that in the ancient world, the hidden, the esoteric, did revolve around certain facts and knowledge that was really hidden, in addition, of course, to the actual wisdom, which is self-secret. But I mean, today we have knowledge of things like psychology, sexuality, the way the human body functions to some extent. the whole idea of the way physical matter is and functions and relates to itself. Like all of these things in the ancient times, like they wouldn't have even been common knowledge for the most part. And there's much that you can know and then sort of do with that knowledge if you know it and then can apply it. In modern times, what I feel like is way more esoteric is the fact that you're right, the sort of the gloss or the glamour of secret societies is that they have secret information or knowledge that if you heard it or saw it or knew it, you would be a different person. But that is never really the case because information doesn't equal transformation and never has and never will. But what they are concealing, if you will, is that each initiatory society, order, what have you, for the most part, the secret heart of it is church, a mass, a communion. Okay. And so then the secret teaching becomes compassion for all beings. Right. And so this is like for us as modern people, again, I don't really know, but I get the sense that this idea wasn't quite so secret back in ancient times because their entire society and culture was kind of constructed around it.
Yeah.
Whereas ours is not. So when we go into our esoteric groups, at the heart of them, at the heart of their spiritual practice is like a communion or mass, like at a church situation. And so for me, that's extraordinary because it's unexpected. At least for me, it was. I don't know about other people. And you're right. And then you find out like, wait a second. So we're not like super special. In fact, we become super regular. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so you have a little bit of, you have sort of a scenario of Jesus hanging out with all the mischief makers, because we all sort of gravitate towards these communities because we have some sort of wound where we want specialness.
Yeah, I don't even know if it's always, if I would describe it even as a wound. I would say like there's people gravitate towards these things for various reasons.
Okay, so that might have been autobiographical.
Yeah, I mean, some of it I think is like, for me, more of like a desire to know the secrets of existence because I have this compulsion to know it. And I think part of that compulsion is a desire to feel superior to other people because they don't know these secrets. But then you've learned the secret, and the secret is compassion for all beings. And then, well, you can't feel superior then. It just sabotages itself. It undercuts it completely.
And we're also talking about the several eyes. So the one eye, the one self that has a noble aim and a noble drive, and then the other eyes that are like, well, once I'm a Buddha, everyone will see.
Yeah, or the other eye that's like, I don't know what this guy's thinking, but I have no intention of doing any of this stuff. And he's crazy if he thinks I'm going to go along with it.
Okay, so let's talk about angels.
All right.
I'm sure there's other methods of spiritual growth. Pico seemed to think that the method was through the angels.
Yeah, that was one of the ones that he identified because it had a long historical tradition within Christianity, this idea of the emulation of angels. It has a long tradition within Judaism, specifically Hasidic Kabbalism. And it has a long tradition within what Pico might refer to as the perennial philosophy, this idea that one holds the image of a perfect being and imitates or emulates that being by holding the image in their mind, by repeating their name, by doing the same sorts of activities that that being would do, by exalting the sorts of ideas, people, beings, substances that that divine being would exalt. And so, and this goes to what we were talking about before, this idea that whatever you contemplate is not only where you are, it's literally what you are, what you become. So this is no different than in Tantra, the idea of deity yoga, which is the main practice, is generation phase deity yoga, which is the same thing as visualization, mantra. You're essentially what's called imputing your I, the capital I, onto something else other than this body mind, which seems crazy, but it's actually possible and has a long tradition. So it's basically becoming something else. But even that language is problematic because it's dualistic, and it seems to take as a given that there is me and the other, which is false. We know, based on non-dual teachings of all of the greatest mystics and prophets and sages of all time. So really what's happening is we are becoming what we truly are already, like, meant to be. We're fulfilling potential by removing all of the veils of delusion and obscuration from reality. And in reality, we find that we are the deity, and that the person that we were pretending to be before was just kind of based on a mistaken perception that we didn't actually have control over, because the mistake, if you will, is entirely prior to consciousness. So
something that I've been thinking about as we work through meditations is this relation to deity yoga and some of the practices of meditation on Christ. And I wonder what you think of them. But it seems like we have this very clear Cartesian duality between embodiment and spirit in our way of thinking. And it seems like the idea of meditating on essentially a sage, an enlightened being, whether or not that's Jesus Christ or that's a deity in the tantric tradition, but what you're telling yourself, and I don't mean to say that all of these practices are only psychological, but it seems like what we're butting heads with is this idea that there's some sort of actual flesh that's different than actual spirit. And the idea of like meditating on a realized being, it seems to disabuse us of that notion.
yeah, I think like there's all these underlying assumptions that we have about this, like spirit and matter, right? And I guess, you know, after doing these practices for years, the question I have is like, why is flesh not spiritual? Like it's literally alive.
Yeah.
And whatever it is that enlivens it, animates it, is a complete mystery to us.
And you're talking about, when you talk about mass, it's a very interesting one too, because this is the blood of God, you know, and the body of God, and it's now going to become your flesh, because it's literally going to become your flesh. And that doesn't seem to be in contradiction to the view.
No, it's in complete coherence with the view.
Yeah.
Because the view is that all is divinity, and we're just participating in that. We're not separate from it. And so, of course, the wine and the cracker is God. It never wasn't God. That's the thing,
And
like there's no transubstantiation that actually has to happen other than in our own mind.
but you're referring to also, it sounds like, or maybe you know this from in Tantra, I believe there's an idea that you purify objects that were always pure to begin with.
Yeah, you're not purifying the object, you're just purifying your own ideas about it.
Yeah.
Because the object was never not pure, right? It's just an object. Like, how could it be impure? Like, it doesn't have, homicidal thoughts or want to steal your girlfriend or, rip you off. Like, those are human things, right? So when we talk about defilement, like only our own thoughts and words and deeds can do that.
So the emulation of angels is pretty abstract idea, because I wouldn't know what angels are like.
So
do you think it's different at the time, or?
I feel like, this whole enterprise requires like a complete education and understanding of Western civilization, essentially. I mean, because, like Pico, for instance, he's a philosopher, he's a prodigy intellectually, he's highly educated. So he already understands, what angels are, the different orders of angels, why they're divided up into different orders based on function, what those functions are, and how those would relate to what we do or could do. For instance, the cherubim are thought to be the angels that are connected with intellect. And so Pico says, in order to emulate the cherubim, which we have to do first before any other orders of angels, and to emulate them would be for us to learn philosophy. And what Pico means by that is we would learn and then understand who we are, what the world is, and how those two relate to one another. This is the ancient adage of know thyself. This is the first step in all mystical paths or authentic spiritual philosophies, is to get a handle on what you are. But you can't actually do that in the beginning. All you can do is get a handle on what you're not. But that's the start.
So
right?
What? Okay, so you're making me curious about, and I've read the text. I think you said, after you read about 11 times, you'll get it. But you're making me think of the portrait you laid of contemplation earlier, because you're saying first you have to think. There's no getting around it. And does the progression through angels proceed in a similar way as the divine union through? Okay.
That's actually a good insight, and it is, because Pico says first you learn to emulate the cherubim, so you learn philosophy, so you know yourself, you know what the world is. And then when you understand that, then you can then emulate the seraphim. And the seraphim's function is devotion to God. And he says, by emulating the seraphim, you'll actually begin to understand what the divine actually is. And then you can be devoted to it. But you can't really be devoted to God before you understand what God even is, which is not like an innate understanding that humans have. It's not. And then he says, once you master devotion to God, then you can act correctly in the world. But he said, if you don't know yourself and what the world is, and you don't know what God is, and you aren't really devoted, then there's no way you can act correctly in the world. And so this, like you said, kind of imitates the progression in contemplation, but also it actually illustrates and sort of embodies this idea of view. Like your view of reality determines your experience completely. And so by adopting certain views and then sort of following up with the activities that that view would engage in, you begin to see the way that the world is not really fragmented in the way that our mind wants it to be, so we can better intellectually understand it. Because it doesn't really work. I mean, it works in instances, it works in our daily life to navigate three-dimensional reality, but it doesn't work in terms of being with the divine.
Is there a literature? Was there a literature on the angels that Pico could draw on that helped to learn that, or was it more learned in practice?
No, I think there was significant literature, specifically Saint Dionysius.
Okay.
You know, because he's writing about these unseen hierarchies, right? And so he's telling us all about them and their function and who they are and their names. And so I feel like that is the sort of touchstone upon which Pico's entire schema is based.
Okay. And you don't seem, Pico's schema is different than other Kabbalist schema, but you don't seem to be preaching it as definitive.
I mean, again, I think it's important to realize that spiritual teachings are not truth. They're method. Or another way to put it, as our teacher has said, is they're efficacious lies. They're not really true, but if you apply the understanding that they impart, they work completely. This is another example of that. It is possible to know the angels, know the orders of the angels, the hierarchy and their function, and then approach them in a different order to reorder them so as to have a different method. And that's really what Pico's doing here, is he is fundamentally recognizing that authentic spiritual paths begin with understanding who we are and what the world is. And so he said, well, then I'm going to make that order of angel that corresponds to that the top instead of second or third in the hierarchy, because to me, that's the most important. Now, this is kind of like a idiosyncratic flourish, if you will. And, you know, he's Pico and he's the preeminent brash philosopher who's in his early 20s, and he felt he could take license and do that. And he did. But I think we also have to recall that despite his great talents and insights, he never attained what we would call stable gnosis or union with the divine as like a way of living.
And you feel that way based on his reading his life?
No, I mean, he never made any claims to it, so
okay.
I have to assume he didn't.
I see.
And his behavior, his writing, like they don't actually exhibit wisdom in that way. They exhibit like immense intellectual insight, tremendous capacity for understanding. but they, in my opinion, they kind of like, they stop at the door of ultimate wisdom.
Okay.
But because if they didn't, Pico wouldn't need to rely so much on authorities to bolster his arguments, right? He would just say, this is just how it is. You accept it, great. You don't, I don't care, because this is how it is. That's not his approach. But that, to me, in my experience, that's the approach of a realized master. They don't need to bolster their argument with other authorities because they're an authority already.
Yes, it's interesting. It's interesting because there are also there also seems to be, I guess I don't know what devotion is on that level, where you know, I feel like there are teachers who are never going to contradict I'm trying to think of a foundational tantric text, but you know, you're never going to hear them saying that the Buddha's wrong about that, or who's the author that I'm thinking of? I'm sorry, I'm blanking on it. There's like the 3-volume Herbert Gunther books on
Oh, the Longchenpa?
Yeah, Longchenpa, thank you. Yeah, you know, it's like, and maybe they're just like, yeah, I mean, I saw the face of reality and it's exactly the same as Longchenpa said it was. So why do I have to argue with Longchenpa? Why do I have to prove to you, kid, that I'm an independent thinker by arguing with Longchenpa? Where Longchenpa and I see the same reality. It's you, kid, that don't know what's going on. So, you know, they don't have to prove to me that they're an independent thinker by smashing idols. So maybe that's why we don't see the internal contradictions, because they're seeing reality in a similar way. It doesn't mean they always language.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, they may not see it exactly the same, but they recognize in the other a knowing that they have themselves. And I think when one has that wisdom, you might refer to other teachers and reference them, but you're not using their words and their arguments to support what you're saying at that point.
It's not
you're saying what you're saying based on your own experience, not based on someone else's words. But Pico's saying it based on others' words.
I see. So
he's not wrong. He's correct. He's 100% correct. It's just, I don't get the impression that he discovered it on his own and lived it on his own enough that he could discard all the experts and authorities, because he didn't. I mean, this is the same sort of thing that happens when one attains a certain level of insight or accomplishment in spiritual practice, and then you look over at your bookshelf and you're like, what the fuck is all this for? Like, I don't need these. Like, this is not it. What just happened was it. Well, the books are pointing to that. And now that I've seen it directly, the books don't mean anything anymore. They're just words now. They lose value. Like, all the words of the authorities lose value when you are in it yourself. You don't need their words because it's right. It's closer than your own heartbeat at that point.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how it is.
Well, that's interesting because I want to talk about your beautiful book. It's really phenomenally beautiful book.
Yeah, Joseph Uccello, the artist who did all the artwork, the book design, the fonts, the layout, everything, just did an amazing job. He's a true artist, craftsman. Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And he took original diagrams like that and redid them to make them enhanced and easier to see and read.
Yeah, so we have these gorgeous, completely intimidating hierarchies of angels. We have a black and white book with just some beautiful touches of red to just make sure it's got that hot topic appeal.
Yeah, and he did just an amazing job because, I mean, you could take an approach and do like classical illustrations of angels, but we've all seen those, and I mean, quite frankly, that'd be a little boring. But what he came up with is so original and amazing and visually striking that it's really evocative.
Yeah, these beautiful, strange abstractions, and they're just kind of colored, spread throughout the book with these beautiful cover. And there's 2 editions. So this is the cover of one of the editions. I don't know if they're still both in print.
I think the deluxe edition sold out a while ago.
Okay.
And there's just probably a few copies of this one left.
Yeah. Well, it's really a gorgeous book. It's really something. Yeah. So I did have a listener question, actually.
Cool.
Yeah, my friend Darius, our friend Darius, told me to ask this as a listener question, which is, do you think that there is a corollary between the tantric system and angels? And do you know what it would be in the meta ecology of tantra?
That's an interesting question. I guess there are connections, but they don't seem to be direct.
Yeah. And I would like it to be direct because in my brain, I want to be writing 777 by Aleister Crowley and it's going, oh, this is that and that is that. But I think that goes back to the intellectual philosophizing that you're saying, that's not how you're going to get there.
Yeah, so this is an interesting sort of consideration because, like, our human mind, based on the way we believe our world to be, like, kind of wants to assume that there's one truth and that all the views of it are just like, blind men on the elephant kind of thing. Right? And so, like, in this question, I feel like the underlying subtext is, aren't angels and dakinis the same thing?
I really want them to be. I desperately want them to be.
But I don't actually. I mean, certainly there seem to be some similarities, right? But it's also, there's not.
Yeah, and
dakinis and dakas and dakinis are inherently like portrayed with as specifically male or female gender, right? And they engage in activities that angels not known for engaging in. Like angels, we see them as almost genderless, right? And
we're innocent in sort of a pre-pubescent.
Well, I mean, the whole idea of the fall from the Garden of Eden involved sex, so angels can't be engaging in that, right? I mean, that's the understanding that goes along with it, is they're not sexual beings in that way. They don't have children. They don't engage in sex for pleasure or procreation.
That doesn't sound like dakas and dakinis, really.
No, it doesn't sound anything like dakas and dakinis. It sounds like the opposite of dakas and dakinis, except that they all exalt the divine and they serve the divine. So couldn't it be that you have different types of beings? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, and then we're also talking about, we're handing in a thesis about a country we haven't been to. So it's different if you're like, well, I've been all the hell realms and I went to the harrowing of hell and here's what it looks like, but you and I are, like you said, we're in our studies going, this book looks like this book, which is
that's exactly right. And we don't really know. And the best that I can gather from things that I've picked up along the way over the years is that they're not the same, but that the angels seem to have an affinity for the spiritual masters who work with the dakinis.
Okay. So
Not,
I want
not that they, work with them, but they just seem like, oh, you serve God, we serve God type of. I mean, and I don't even know that they would use that terminology. It was
right.
like, you serve the divine, we serve the divine. Like we're on the same side. We're on the same, we have the same intention. So we can work together. We could be amicable.
So I have so I write a fair bit about angels in my fiction. Which is not what you're supposed to do if you write science fiction and fantasy is write about dragons. Dragons sell. I think Brandon Sanderson's page is called Write About Dragons. If you listen to fantasy and science fiction publishing podcast or marketing podcast, they say write about dragons. I write about angels. It seems like some interpretations of angels are not so fleshy and incorporated as we're talking about. And there's this sort of idea that an angel is a transmission or a message, and that an angel is their mission. And that's why you can't have two angels that serve the same purpose, because then you're talking about one angel.
Well, the way I understood it was from Arya Kaplan's book.
Oh, beautiful.
Where I think it was Meditation in Cabala, where he's talking about an angel is similar to a thought. And so the idea is like a thought is single, like it's single pointed. Like you can't have a single thought that's divergent on two different things. It's always on a single thing. And this is how angels are. They have one function, not more than one. And so if there was multiple functions, you would have multiple angels.
So you mean the thought, you mean that you could have like a thought is one thing, not, you might have the same thought several times, but if I said, what is your book about? You'd say it's a book about angels, because that's what you thought to write about. You wouldn't say it's a book about angels and about angels and about angels, because it's one idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so angels are thought of in a similar way. Now, Pico expressed the idea that angels do participate in substance material phenomenon. Many have said that they do not, like they're not corporeal. They don't have a body of flesh. They are not made up of matter the same way that the human body is. Pico disagreed. He said if they are participating in life, which we take to be material, then they have to have some aspect of materiality, even if it's not as dense as ours is. But I mean, again, I would go back to what I said earlier, that I see flesh as inherently spiritual. And in my view, which again, I don't expect anyone else to accept, is that there is no substance material phenomena at all. And so there is no conflict between spirit and matter, because there is no matter, and consequently, there's nothing that you could distinguish as spirit. So you could say it's light and space. That I would go along with. But the idea of angels, like clearly there's a history, tradition, experience of beings that serve divinity and seem to aid and or correct human beings. And I don't know that those are two different things either. So this idea of angels and what they are has always been problematic, except for those who simply have faith.
Okay, so I want to, I didn't know where, if there was any place to go after that, but there's one more place to go.
I don't
which
know
is,
if I even answered Darius's question.
yeah,
Can we go back and just make sure that I did?
sure. And props to Darius, which is I wasn't trying to say he was coming from that place, but I realized in his question that I was coming from a place of thinking that I was trying to apply everything I already knew to understand what I was learning, which is happens to be the exact opposite of spiritual growth. So there's that. But yeah, so Darius's question, I mean, it sounds like we are not sure.
So repeat his question again.
Yeah, it was I believe the question was, is there a corollary, or are angels in our system, and in what guise, and what, under what name, are they in the tantric system?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
No.
I want to ask one last thing, I guess, which is, you mentioned something interesting, I think, which is you said angels seem to be aiding and or correcting human beings, and that might be the same thing. And that's something I'm starting to learn now, not just through a spiritual process, but also through a therapeutic process, which is I'm starting to, have this loving, wonderful relationship with my therapist. And I'm like, I don't want to go into the negative transference phase. And my therapist is like, you mean you don't want to finish the therapeutic process, because you don't actually get to skip the part of the correcting,
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, nobody really wants the correcting part, but unfortunately, that's the part that actually makes the difference.
And so that maybe goes back to this idea of several eyes, which we're taking from the Gurdjieffian work and his student Ouspensky, that maybe one of your eye is dedicated enough, one of your selves is dedicated enough that it will handle a couple of the other ones burning up in the process.
Yeah, I feel like that's what the correction actually does, is it shames and confuses and shocks the I who actually wants to do the right thing so much that he's willing to get the other ones in line.
Yeah, so
which he doesn't really want to do. Like he doesn't, it's just like, I don't want to confront those parts of myself. They're scary, they're angry, they're going to beat me up, they're going to take my lunch money, and how am I supposed to deal with that?
Yeah, there's this idea in Diamond Heart, Book 1, Elements of the Real in Man.
Oh yeah, we have that here.
Yeah, A.H. Almas. I love this book, but I think it's in the chapter of trust, or it might be on truth. It might be on trust. Yeah, I think it's in trust, where he says, like, the childish version of trust is you're not going to hurt me, and then a later version is it might hurt, but I know it's has my best interest at heart, or the best interest at heart, right? But when you see it play out in the movies, because it's like, at first you just like put a little bit of bread and see if the orphan is like gonna come and trust you, and later they'll trust you enough to put the needle in there to pull out the splinter, but not initially. And so this idea that trust might not mean not getting hurt is an interesting one for me, because I get skittish in that way. And you're talking about how the grace of the divine, it's phrased in Meditation on the Tarot in a quote from St. John of the Cross, which I might get wrong, but it says that, we're not any more loathsome or despicable or unlovable, but we see these aspects of ourselves that we didn't see before, and we feel like a loathsome object, where nothing's changed, but we were just unaware of some character traits that we might have had.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's really what's changed, is the awareness of it has surfaced and arisen to make itself known. And then the reaction to it is like, can we see that and not take it to be who we really are and then retreat in shame as like, oh, I'm really a bad person, like I don't deserve any love and I should just go hide and not be around anyone. But that is also like buying into the mistaken perception, which is the whole reason you're being corrected anyway. So like
you have a mistaken perception of yourself in the world.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So the reaction to the correction can be problematic if it is rooted in mistaken perception itself.
Yeah.
So the reaction to the correction, if it's at all possible, has to be like no judgment, like yes, I see it, it's not good, but it's also not who I am. It's not my identity.
And that might not be,
And I don't claim it as mine. Like, yeah, I did that, it happened, but it's not who I am. And it's not, and I will not assume that for you or anyone else.
okay. I don't think there's anywhere to go from there.
Not sure.
I do want to plug, you've got your book out, Celestial Intelligences. We're still working through Meditations on the Tarot. We just finished the chapter on the Hermit. So if people are interested, that's
we're not even at the halfway point yet. And it would be easy to catch up because all of these meetings are recorded and, someone could listen to all of them probably in a weekend or, a few days. And if they wanted to join in, it would be fairly easy to do so.
So tell us how people can find this of yours, how they can join, how they can get plugged in, and maybe if they can get plugged into any of your other work.
Yeah, thanks. So to join our Meditations on the Tarot study circle, or just to get access to listen to the meetings and learn about it, you can subscribe at chamberofreflection.com or our Occult of Personality Patreon. Either one of those methods will get you access to it, and the meeting times and Zoom information is all posted there for our next study circle meeting, so people can join us. And when they do that, they'll also get access to our Discord servers and our discussions. And I feel like it's been it's just an incredible blessing. Like the people involved, the level of interaction and discourse, the insights that we were able to uncover, it's all like a really sublime process. And if people are interested, I would love for them to join us. But I also understand this is a very, very specialized study that we're doing, and it's going to appeal to some people, and other people it might not. But if there are people listening who are interested, I would definitely encourage you to check it out. And even if you just want to see what it's like, you can join, and if you don't like it, you can always cancel. But I say give it a chance, because I think if you listen to these discussions and hopefully join us for one, you're going to find that we dive into this tarot material so deeply that I don't know how one could participate in that and not be affected to a really extreme degree.
So I'm thinking of the show Friday Night Lights, where one of the episodes, the coach says, it's not about football. And I'm so mad at the writers because I'm like, of course it's not about football, but you don't tell us that. But so I'll spoil it. It's not really about tarot. It's kind of about tarot, but it's different. And then we did talk a fair bit about Tantra. And so maybe it's a good time to plug again your book, because it is on, I can't remember the phrasing. Is it on the preliminary practices?
Yeah, so it's called Pronaos, a perspective on the preliminary. It's a Western perspective on the preliminary practices of Buddhist Tantra. So I'm basically explaining these preliminary practices from the view of someone who knows Western philosophy and Western esotericism and is familiar with that, but not so much the Eastern sources, because I'm familiar with the Western sources and I understand what I'm doing from that perspective more than I do from the Eastern. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's just ways of understanding. If it helps me understand better, I think it's good. And I feel like for other Westerners, this is useful because we have access and understanding about our own traditions that will give us incredibly deep insights into tantric traditions and practices, so that we could understand them and practice them with much more understanding. And then as a result, the result of the practice is much better, in my opinion.
Will you tell us what the name of your book, what it means? Pronous?
Pronaos. It's a term, an ancient Greek term for the portico of a temple. So that area of the temple where you go up the steps and it's past the pillars, but you haven't gone through the doorway of the entrance to the building yet. So and that's exactly what these preliminary practices are. They're the porch before you enter into Tantra. They're required in order to do the actual practices of Tantra. Now, in and of themselves, they are tantric practices, but because of the nature of Tantra, like, you can have access to them, you can practice them without the same level of intensity or understanding that's required for the formal generation phase deity yoga practices. These are basically practices that develop the body mind to be able to do the actual practice, because one's not simply just not capable of jumping into deity yoga and doing it properly. And having done the preliminary practices and now practicing the deity yoga, I 100% concur. That is exactly true. If I had jumped right into deity yoga, I wouldn't be able to do it at all. I can barely do it now. So I can't even imagine trying to jump into it without doing the preliminaries first. I mean, the preliminaries teach one how to accomplish things, not just the spiritual practice. It teaches you how to accomplish anything in life.
Do you feel like your ability to execute and with tasks in general has changed?
It's like a complete change. Like, I used to be incapable, unable. I would be the last person you'd ask to do anything because I would bungle it and fumble it and probably give you an excuse after excuse why I couldn't do it. And now, if something needs to be done, generally I just do it and that's it. And even if I can't do it or don't know how, I'll figure it out. And before, that just wasn't even on the table. So I don't know. I mean, I never thought of myself in the past as somebody who was incapable or unable to do anything. But having gone through this process, I look back on the old me as kind of pathetic in that respect.
Yeah, I have that experience. I don't know how capable I am, but I wouldn't trade it for how capable I was.
Well, I mean, I look at you now and I've, like, you do like all the things that are required to live an independent life and
That was not who I was.
function. Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, you weren't like that before. So you've obviously improved.
Yeah, I mean, they call me kid, so that could go two ways. So I've enjoyed the benefits of being being, I'll say, less reliant on others.
I agree. I never want to really be reliant on others, but I also know that that's like interdependence is a fact of existence. So,
well, I'm relying on others in terms of, I have people I can turn to work things out, to give me a different perspective. And we have these channels through prayer and such that we're talking about, of these celestial intelligences in whatever tradition. But I guess I would say that I would rather, if I'm not relying on those, then I'm relying on everybody else around me. So I have to be reliant.
you have to, but the thing is, like, truly we can only rely on the divine.
Yeah.
Because you can't really rely on human beings. I'm a human being and I know myself, and I know, like, you could rely on me somewhat, but you're better off not.
Right.
Better off not.
Yeah, no, I don't think I think when I was looking for that, again, in Diamond Heart, he says, when you're in that undeveloped stage, you're looking at everyone else as a pair of kids to just nurture you and take care of you. And so I think if I don't have reliance on those higher powers, then I look for it in the wrong places. I'll say that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like that's a normal human tendency.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like, I often look for solace or reinforcement in, like, how I feel, my, like, bodily health, or in relationships. But those things can never provide any kind of ultimate happiness because they're always falling apart. So
yeah, they were like, I'm not against their maintenance, but the
no,
whole reason that they require maintenance
100%
because they're not reliable.
maintenance. Yeah, they need maintenance, but they're not like you wouldn't, it's like in Buddhism, you wouldn't say they're objects of refuge, right? You would say they're not worthy objects of refuge.
Yeah.
And that's correct. It doesn't mean we don't take care of ourselves or cultivate positive relationships, but we don't rely on them for our contentment and happiness.
And that's in part because the continued efforts to make them deliver that are actually the cause of our suffering.
They never promised to deliver that, and they don't have the capacity to do that. And if we try to squeeze blood from a stone, it just doesn't work. I'm mixing metaphors here, but you know what I
was
mean.
trying to. I never understood that. What does it mean in the Bible?
What do you mean?
Blood from a stone. I thought it was a.
You can't get blood from a stone. No. You can't get something from nothing. No. Which is interesting because the Bible, like, that is the story of creation. This is something from nothing.
Yeah. But it won't. You can't trade that in at the bank, at least.
You can't really trade it in for anything anywhere.
All right. Well, brother Greg Kaminsky.
Thank you, kid. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you, and I hope people have been able to follow our crazy conversation here.
Yeah, and if you're just itching for more, if we didn't ramble on long enough, you can join us to talk about the Wheel of Fortune.
That would be awesome. Yeah. So November, what is it, 26th? I think we're meeting to do that.
1 p.m.
Yeah.
New York time, Eastern Standard Time.
Yeah. So hopefully
people you can find on PDF. You can find recordings of it on YouTube, etc. Or you can buy the book.
Yeah, for sure. So I hope if people hear this before November 26th and want to join us, they, go to chamberofreflection.com or go to Occult of Personality Patreon and sign up and join our Zoom call, or listen, after it's recorded. But It's great. I mean, I love those meetings, and I can't tell you how joyful it makes me feel.
Yeah, I'm a full evangelist for this book. So
Yeah, me too. It's really, I think, probably one of the few Western esoteric books that I felt like transcended the genre altogether. Like, it's so great that it could be read by someone who's not really interested in like Western esotericism, and they could still appreciate what's being communicated.
yeah, yeah, they sell it at Catland and on the Pope's desk, so it's got a range to it.